Right now, something very unusual is happening. It's a big deal because it's so rare. The most powerful bank in the world, the Federal Reserve, is losing money. This started in 2022, and it's something we almost never see. The last time it happened was way back in 1916. In 2023, the Federal Reserve is expected to lose around $100 billion, and economists think it might lose even more, between $100 to $150 billion next year. You might be wondering how a bank that can basically create money is losing it. Did they do risky things like start a gambling YouTube channel,
Up 300K.
I needed that one.
invest in Coinbase, or go all in on Dogecoin with Elon Musk? Well, the answer is a bit more complicated. It's because of something called interest rates. Since March 2022, the person in charge of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, has been working to control something called inflation. He's been doing this by raising interest rates. This means it's more expensive for people and businesses to borrow money. It also increases the cost of the debt that the United States has. So that's why the Federal Reserve is losing money. It's all because of these interest rates going up.
The national debt increased by nearly 90% since the beginning of the pandemic. But many economists and politicians warn that the ever-expanding national debt can be harmful to the economy.
And unfortunately, we're using it for rainy days and
Right now, the total amount of money the United States owes, known as the national debt, is about $33 trillion. This is the highest it has ever been, and it's such an incredibly huge number that economists are having a debate about what we should do about it. Some economists say that if we don't start reducing this debt, it's going to become a big problem. They worry that future generations, like our children, will have to bear the burden of paying it off, and it could be really tough for them. But there are other economists who argue that this massive debt isn't as scary as it seems. They say that a lot of this money is basically the U.S. owing itself, like an accounting trick. So they believe it's not as important to worry about because it's like moving money around within the country.
The thing that we refer to as the national debt is really nothing more than an accounting record. It's keeping track of how many dollars the government has added to the broader economy, minus how many dollars it has subtracted away from us, mostly through taxation.
Is there a reason you should want debt to be zero, precisely zero? No, there's no reason for that.
In today's video, I'll explain all the nitty-gritty details of how the Federal Reserve began losing money and why it's become such a serious issue. We'll also talk about who might be responsible for fixing this problem. So let's dive right in and get started.
At the end of July 2023, when the debt was about $300 billion less, roughly $7 trillion of that was intragovernmental debt holdings, meaning the government owes itself that money. The majority of the debt, about $25.7 trillion, was held by the public.
You might have come across a statistic that suggests if every person in the U.S. started chipping in to pay off the national debt, they'd owe around $98,000. If we narrow it down to just taxpayers or working-class folks, that number balloons to over $250,000 each. This kind of information is often used to make people upset or sway their voting decisions. However, it's not entirely accurate, and here's why. That massive $33 trillion national debt is split into two main parts: intragovernmental debt and something called debt held by the public. Now, the debt held by the public, even though it sounds like it's money the public owes, is actually the opposite. It's money the government owes to various entities, like insurance companies, mutual funds, pension funds, and sometimes even other countries. Right now, that portion is around $26 trillion. You might be wondering, how did the government end up owing so much money to its own people?
That either says, I owe you this much money in the future, or I'm...
Now, here's where things get really interesting. The Federal Reserve, which is responsible for managing the country's money supply, setting interest rates, and lending money to the government by buying treasury bonds, has a unique status. Even though it's part of the government, it's also a private institution. Its debt is considered debt held by the public, not intergovernmental debt. This means that a portion of the $26 trillion that the government owes is actually owed to the Federal Reserve. Here's why the Federal Reserve is now losing money. When the Federal Reserve prints money, even though it doesn't literally print physical bills, it's not creating cash. Instead, it buys things like mortgage-backed securities and treasury bonds, adding them to its balance sheet or portfolio. This is a way the Federal Reserve controls inflation and interest rates. When the Federal Reserve adds these assets, it stimulates the economy, a process known as quantitative easing. They did a lot of this from early 2020 to March 2022, which helped boost the prices of assets like Bitcoin, tech stocks, and real estate. Now, they're doing the opposite, known as quantitative tightening. They're selling off assets in their portfolio, which slows down the economy. You can see this in the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, which is now shrinking. Here's why the Federal Reserve is losing money. In Q2 of 2023, the Federal Reserve had about $5.5 trillion in Treasury bonds, earning about 2%, and $2.6 trillion in mortgage-backed securities, earning around 2.2%. However, the debt they had was costing them 5% in interest. In simple terms, the money they were making from these investments was less than what they were paying in interest on their debt. When they were adding assets to their portfolio, interest rates were low. Now that they're selling assets, they're not earning as much on their newer, higher-rate investments. This imbalance resulted in the Federal Reserve making $88.4 billion in income in the first half of the year, but paying out $141.8 billion in interest expenses. So, they had a loss of about $53 billion in the first half of the year, and if this continues, they could double their losses by the end of the year. If you're still following along and haven't fallen asleep from all this complicated stuff, you're doing great, and thank you for sticking with it.
The thing that we refer to as the national debt is really nothing more than an accounting record. It's keeping track of how many dollars the government has added to the broader economy, minus how many dollars it has subtracted away from us, mostly through taxation.
Is there a reason you should want debt to be zero, precisely zero? No, there's no reason for that.
That either says, I owe you this much money in the future, or I'm going to pay you interest at these particular time